Thank you. I'll share the screen. All right. Is that all good?
Yeah, we can see your talk and we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to talk about Dinas Dinlle. And this was a focus of my master's thesis, which I submitted in 2020. So I hope to provide a bit of also updated information, given the subsequent excavations that have happened in the last few years. But my thesis was really looking at more of a social question about the creation of social memory and how that's used to build community over a long time span. And so my case study was using Dinas Dinlle and the fourth branch of the Mabinogi. I'm sure so many of you are aware of the importance of geographical locations and place names within those tales. So I wanted to possibly dig down a bit deeper and think about what the social mechanisms were behind those processes. So I grounded this in the idea of the possibility of a long Iron Age for Northwest Wales. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that first. Then I'll talk about Dinas Dinlle. I won't go into detail about the excavations themselves, but a general overview, and then hope to discuss the fourth branch as well, given the constricts of time. So the traditional British Iron Age is generally categorized as the 800 years, roughly between 750 BC, 43, 48 AD. And we know that's always up for debate. But that's based on the dating of the Wessex excavations. And we know that something different is happening in many different regions in Britain. So those areas that are largely outside the scope of persistent Roman attention may require a different system. And within these areas, the Iron Age classification may extend well into the historic period. So if we look at Atlantic Scotland, for example, or Scandinavia, and we see that sometimes this moves all the way into the later or early medieval periods. So for both the Scottish and Northern British archaeological chronologies, it's common to view the Iron Age as part of a much longer period of development than is found further south. And additionally, interactions with the Roman army is increasingly seen as an insufficient reason to mark the end of the period of the Iron Age within the 1st century AD. So in Wales, and particularly Northern Wales, Northwest Wales, we see that between the 1st and 4th centuries AD, it may not have been that dissimilar to the situation in southern Scotland. So the Romans did build around 9 well-networked, visible, and strategic forts in the area. And traditionally, this would bring Wales into conversations regarding the adoption of Romano-British culture. But there have continued to be questions about the actual influences of Romanitas. So it's also been argued that in parts of Wales, Roman influence on day-to-day life may not have been as significant as originally thought. And it's also clear from the archaeological evidence that styles of settlement from the pre-Roman period do continue. And Dinas Dinlle is a good example of this, which we'll look at in a bit. So the difficulty, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is in studying hill fort trends in Wales, we only have a small proportion of sites that have been excavated in detail, and the dating also has been conjectural, although this continues to improve. So we'll look at Dinas Dinlle now using the lens of a possible long Iron Age. And you can see here it's along the Carnarvon coastline, and it's pretty much on its own. So it's a majorly defended Iron Age and Romano-British hill fort. It's constructed on a hill created by glacial movement during the late glacial period, and it's positioned on the coastal plain at the mouth of the Menai Straits, which is right here. And it has a view to the south towards Penllyn and southern Ynysmon as well. So you get a very good visual radius all the way around when you are standing on Dinas Dinlle. It also features monumentality in the form of boundaries. So we have a polygonal enclosure, a high inner rampart, and outer terraced rampart that is divided by a deep ditch. So the fort is estimated to have been measured approximately 230 meters north by south and 145 meters east to west. And it would have originally enclosed an estimated 4 hectares, but 1/5 of the site has been lost to coastal erosion. Unfortunately, that is what's prompted such detailed excavations over the last few years in hopes that we can recover the finds, the archaeologically sensitive finds within that site before they are completely eroded. So a survey by Gwynedd Archaeological Trust determined that the original ground beneath the Iron Age ramparts are still visible within the heavily eroding sections. And their survey also noted traces of circular or rectangular structures within the eastern areas of the interior. This is proposed to be a possible Bronze Age burial mound or a tower of some sort. It remains unclear. And finds within the environs, within the fort itself and in the eroding areas include some coins with the date of the 3rd century. So it pushes the use or the engagement with the site into the Romano-British period. So Gwynedd Archaeological Trust carried out excavations in 2019, 2021, and 2022 in response to the coastal erosion, and funding and support for these excavations was provided by the joint EU-funded Cherish project, which have also done a lot of scientific surveys and analysis. CADU, the National Trust, and the Welsh Areas of Outstanding Natural Beauty, their Sustainable Development Fund. Bangor University also participated in some of the community excavation as well, and was used as a training opportunity. So in 2021, there was a substantial 13.6 meter diameter roundhouse with a possible doorway on the eastern side uncovered. And you can see this picture here at the bottom of the screen. So while the roundhouse was originally thought to be constructed of solid stone, it turns out that the core of the walls are earthen. So this connects it, which Dave just talked about, Chickeri, this actually connects it with some of the building styles on Penllyn as opposed to Anglesey or elsewhere. So that was a very interesting development, especially looking at the late Bronze Age site of Machleonydd down on the peninsula. So questions about interconnectedness in the region continue to come up and need to be explored more fully. We have pottery from the site. We have a jet bead, tools, metal objects, cornstone, and some coins. So it's a site with finds. I think that they are both Iron Age and Romano-British. And you can see here we have a time slice of the hill fort interior with some roundhouse. We have a metalled surface. We have the cliff edge over to that western side that is encroaching on the features there as well. So to the south of the fort, a zigzag anomaly on the survey may also possibly indicate a roadway leading to the fort entrance. So it's been suggested that this may have been a village setting with multiple roundhouses. So like other roundhouses of this size, there would have been significant human effort to build both the ramparts, the ditch, and the structures inside, and you would need access to natural resources as well, including human capital. So to the south of the fort are field systems with boundaries and a later field system and settlement that was demolished in the 19th century. The significance of the site is also enforced by its proximity to the Roman outpost at Saguntium. But whether the site had direct contact or continued contact with that is still unclear. Challenges to understanding the site are also due to just sand inundation. So there was a major 14th century storms that relocated large volumes of sand, which accumulated inside the hill fort, which altered its appearance from what would have been seen in earlier generations. So during the site's main construction and occupation periods, it would have been more of an estuary environment. And it's thought that the sea would have been a further out 1 kilometer from the current point that it is now. So the main transport was likely by sea, although Dave Hopewell and Louise Barker note evidence for a possible timber trackway leading across the plain and into the fort. Although we do know that there is Atlantic trade happening, established sea routes during this period, particularly evidenced by the anchor stock found off Porthvelin on Pentline, dating to possibly the 1st or 2nd centuries BC. So we see that Mediterranean vessels were present in Cardiff Bay, although the full extent of Roman engagement is still largely unknown. However, it's clear from its location and from the archaeological features inside that Dinas Dinlle could be evoking what Oliver Davis calls a vocabulary of power in the region, particularly looking at the coastline there, and there's not any other fort like it. So it occupies a very prominent position. This also brings to mind Barry Cunliffe's reminder that Britain is an island and the sea a highway. So this is a reconstruction we have here done by Wessex Archaeology and Cherish, and then we have a reconstruction of the possible coastline around AD 100. So you can see that it would have actually come off the shoreline a little bit there, so to provide some context for the landscape. But I'd also like to talk now about social theory and its potential application. So while your eyes are on this village reconstruction here, you can begin to think about the role of the community within the region and how this may have persisted well into the 1st millennium AD. So similar to other hill forts in Britain, Dinas Dinlle is located in this prominent position. It's visually dominating the surrounding landscape, and the scale and the architecture of the boundaries place them as key media for symbolic activity. And the physical enclosure creates a specialized space apart from the fields and unenclosed farmsteads. So Gary Locke argues for the power of emotion in the creation of hill fort sites, arguing that hill fort creation moves just beyond defensive functions. Through the various buildings and repair phases of boundary spaces, the difference between life inside and life outside remains a focal point of the community. John Barrett also proposes that residential Iron Age communities like those found here and in Wessex and other areas of Britain may have created for themselves a form of common history, perhaps even linking them to a founding ancestor or lineage, but that history will have lain firmly in creating a mythical past, which could be recalled orally through memory and storytelling. This may also be considered for Dinas Dinlle because we see it reappear in the early literature of the time. So we'll now leave the Iron Age and we'll move into the early medieval period and consider why a site like Dinas Dinlle would continue to persist in the consciousness or the social memory of the community or of the region. So first, we can have a little help in defining cultural memory. So it can be defined many different ways, but two that are useful is an umbrella term used to describe the complex ways in which societies remember their past using a variety of media. It's also mutable, nonlinear, active, ongoing, and can bestow or reinforce authority. So here we talk about the 4th branch of the Mabinogi then. So it's a grouping of 4 tales recorded in the White Book of Rhydderch and the Red Book of Hergest. So the White Book of Rhydderch is dated to the later half of the 14th century, possibly, and thought to have been commissioned by Rhydderch ap Ewan Lloyd and put to parchment at or near the Cistercian Abbey at Strata Florida. Daniel Hughes estimates the date of the White Book to Daniel Hughes, however, estimates the date of the White Book to AD 1350 and the Red Book dated later, perhaps AD 1382 or 1410, 1410. It is within the White Book that we have the first evidence that brings the 4 branches of the Mabinogi together. The tales are not attributed to an author, and Shauna Davis suggests that these texts may have been part of the collective memory of the period. It may also be within these tales there are reflexes of an older Celtic tradition, as suggested by Patrick Ford, and this is a point that continues to be quite contentious between scholars. John Ballard's translation of the Mabinogi and accompanying photographs displays the geographical precision of the tales, and he observes, to quote, "It can be hard to differentiate at times whether the countryside is an embodiment of these tales or the tales are an explanation of the land itself." Considering the significance of the specific features in the landscape within the fourth branch, we are exercising what Patrick Ford calls narrative attention. It simply means giving considerable attention to what normally in text would receive little attention. Patrick Ford states that it means apparently irrelevant matter introduced into the text, however brief, is there for a reason and deserves our attention. So building on Ford's view, it is clear that geography and landscape create a strong sense of place within this tale. Alfred Sievers, in his study of reading the landscape of Wales as a central character in the Mabinogi, argues that within the four branches is actually a dialogue between Christian cosmology and older narratives of ancestral relations to the land. And these narratives are mediating between the physical land of Wales and the early medieval Welsh cultural concerns. So the incorporation of prehistoric sites or places as significant, mythic, and liminal spaces possibly reinforce Sievers' reading of the tales as knitting ancestral lore and land together. In the tale, Lleu Gyffes and his magician uncle and father figure Gwydion spend the majority of their time traversing the land, and in the fourth branch as a whole, there are 44 place names mentioned in a mix of geographical locations, onomastic stories, and administrative districts. However, I'll only briefly address the locations that are associated with Lleu, specifically those who may have had a prehistoric and association that could fall within the Long Iron Age. Now, in interest of time, I will need to cut through a bit of them, but Lleu has a mysterious birth, and after he is born, he is taken to Dinas Dinlle when he is ready to be brought up and brought through rites of passage in order to become a man. So until he reaches maturity, he is living at Dinas Dinlle. Within the bounds of Dinas Dinlle, the tale, as translated by Sinead Davis, tells us, he was brought up until he could ride every horse and until he had matured as regards appearance and growth and size. So within the fourth branch, we see a wide array of place names and locations. This also supports what Tim Ingold says about landscape, that it itself tells a story. And to quote Tim, he writes, "It enfolds the lives and times of predecessors who, over generations, have moved around in it and played their part in its formation. To perceive the landscape is therefore to carry out an act of remembrance. And remembering is not so much a matter of calling up an internal image stored in the mind as engaging perceptually with an environment that is pregnant with the past." So reading the fourth branch in this way, and perhaps the Mabinogi in its entirety, offers a fresh approach to considering the cultural impact of the tales. The effects of the dialogue between the land and its people reflected very real concerns of both the Iron Age community and Romano British communities at Dinas Dinlle and the early medieval communities. So I'd like to suggest that possibly in the fourth branch, we see a construction of cultural continuity where ancestral traditions become a landscape narrative that create a sense of place that is created incorporating ancient space. And we witness a negotiation of a different type of vocabulary of power. So rather than the vocabulary of power of a physical hill fort in the prehistoric period, we now have a metaphorical vocabulary of power, which is enduring within the tales themselves. So when Lleu was brought up at Dinas Dinlle, he was enclosed within a safe training ground away from the volatility of the world outside. Yet his part divine nature would have associated the place with power, so it is imbuing power and authority. So the distinctions also between genealogical history and mythological history are important to consider as those lines blur over time, including those in the prehistoric period. So the communities in the prehistoric period structure their contemporary world, not just with the exigencies of the present, but also through a complex consciousness of the past. Genealogical history, in the view of Gosden and Locke, consisted of interplay between human memory, memory devices, with the biggest memory prompt of all coming from the nature of the landscape. However, genealogical history is limited to a moving moment, so individuals and kinship connections are eventually lost or blurred to time. Mythic history, on the other hand, relies on its age and obscure origins to imbue it with contemporary force and power. While Gosden and Locke are primarily applying this theory to Iron Age communities and their relationships with megalithic tombs, it's possible that we also see these mythic histories scattered throughout the Fourth Branch, as prehistoric and Romano-British locations are reinvested as the home of divine rulers, having lost their moving moment, but becoming a part of the region's mythic history. Today, I hope I have inspired you to think how this dramatic site moved from a visible community enclosure to the home of a mythic figure, investing the place with new and continued potency. Loney and Hain assert that communities desire continuity with the past in order to lay the ground for the future. And the process by which these communities create an understanding of their predecessors through memory, which is maintained intentionally and physically, and through tracing the evidence of Dinas Dinlle's origins to its ultimate literary memorialization, we witness a physical site with prehistoric roots transforming into a site with mythic importance, taking its place within the social and cultural memory of the early medieval period. Now, fortunately for us, the National Trust has approved plans for the roundhouse to be left partially exposed, which will greatly benefit the community and the cultural legacy that this site has in the continued cultural memory of the region. So I encourage you to visit. Thank you.